Luke gets his hand cut off, finds out Vader's his father, hand gets frozen and taken away by Boba Fett. It ends on such a down note.
It's the rebellion's darkest hour.
There was a time when heroes and villains alike lived in the shadows of the Empire.
This thing rules. This thing rules.
Oh, hey, what's up? I'm Brian Altano.
And I'm Max Scoville.
This is a show where we discuss something we love,
Unpack why we love it,
explain where it came from,
try to remember our first impressions of it,
share our weird stories about it,
maybe learn something new about it along the way.
but first and foremost, we're here to celebrate the fact that this thing rules.
Okay, so Shadows of the Empire was the first Star Wars movie that wasn't a movie.
That is the best way of putting it. Shadows of the Empire, I think for our age group, was the closest we had come to a sort of like all of the trappings of a theatrical experience of a new Star Wars, because Return of the Jedi came out like when I was like 2 or 3, and all the other Star Wars movies came out before I was born. So we hadn't yet received the special editions, I don't believe. And all of a sudden there was this big new thing that felt like a new Star Wars movie because it had a soundtrack and a comic book and a video game and toys and all the other fun stuff we can talk about. And it looked like it, right? Like, and it took place between 2 Star Wars movies that we had already seen and memorized and were obsessed with. But, it wasn't a Star Wars movie. Like, you couldn't actually sit down in a theater. You could close your eyes and listen to the soundtrack and pretend,
It was
but
everything but a movie.
Everything but a movie, yeah.
It was a novel, a junior novelization. It was a pop-up book. It was a comic book. It was a video game. It was action figures. It was micro machines. It was model kits. It was trading cards. It was, I think, basically every possible form of media. I think the only ones they didn't do were like radio drama and
or candy.
I mean, I feel like they might have even done
There probably
candy.
even was a candy. I mean, they didn't do what they do with the new Star Wars movies, where like they're like, it's Yoda oranges, and you're like, why?
Yeah, it wasn't. They didn't have any Yoda oranges.
Didn't go that crazy, but
no, it's wild because in my mind, I guess I kind of just blur things together. But I remember this being a thing that I cared about at the same time as the special editions. But I completely forgot this was before the special editions. This was 1996, and at that point, this was like when I was just getting into Star Wars. Like this was straight up like my entry point to the entire universe. And at that point, sorry, galaxy. It's a galaxy, not a universe. They don't say universe over there. At that point, I think I knew that a bunch of stuff about it existed. Like I knew there were a lot of books. I knew there were novels out there. That was when I started reading like the Tales of the Bounty Hunters book and stuff like that. But I think there was a sense of discovery there, and the fact that Shadows of the Empire was happening on some level, I don't think I fully grasped that it was like a new thing. I thought it was like something they discovered, like part of history. Like, and there's that feeling in the same way that I foolishly sort of up until embarrassingly late in life assumed that the people who write X-Men or Spider-Man or whatever have some kind of long-term plan. Like they know where this is going, and that like Chris Claremont in the late 70s was like, I know what's going to happen in the 90s. Shit's going to get real weird. I thought that Star Wars, and again, it has its canon, it has its lore, but I thought that there was something real about this.
Yeah.
Like that's
a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, and it was never part of Lucas's plan whatsoever. I mean, I think he cooked the characters up, but this was mostly just filling in the blanks. Like this was probably the most, I mean, it was definitely the most like successful and widespread instance of, I guess what was called expanded universe at the time.
Yeah.
Even though you're supposed to call it galaxy, whatever. This stuff is all now considered legends. Like it didn't, none of it happened. None of it ever happened. It's all fake. It's all pretend. But in 2014, they went and basically nuked it from orbit, scorched the earth, whatever, and said that everything prior to that doesn't count, and everything after that does count, and it's officially organized by the story group. They keep track of everything that happened. And Shadows of the Empire has been sort of cherry picked for tidbits that have been made canon. So like little bits of it have been kind of dusted off and repurposed elsewhere. Like let's see let's get into what Shadows of the Empire actually is. It takes place.
Shadows of the Empire takes place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and like you touched on it for a second there. For us, and I think for a lot of people, unless you're like 50 or something like that, no offense to 50-year-olds, you're from a galaxy a long time ago and a far, far away. But Star Wars always felt like something that was already happening by the time we got to it, right? And there's a used future element of it that also makes it feel like it's been happening within its own universe for a long time. You know, wars are long and exhausting, and it just felt like there was always history, not baggage, but history in an interesting way. And at the time, there was a lot of expanded universe stuff that you could kind of pick and choose. You could pick up a comic book, or, you know, find some action figures or something like that. Or there was tons of novels at the time. And I remember I'd read a couple of them, notably the Tales from Jabba's Palace, Tales of the Bounty Hunters, those. But a lot of the other ones felt really overwhelming to me, because it would be like this off-model Luke Skywalker, or like Han Solo is, you know, he's holding a lightsaber or something. Or it's just this very painterly sort of like, it just felt like it felt like a legend before it was a legend, right? Like it felt like, it's like, oh, so did this happen? Does this count? Like what's going on the book side of this thing, right? And then canonically, between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, it's one of the most interesting time periods in all of Star Wars, because Empire Strikes Back notably ends on a sort of a down note, right? With a little bit of hope. Looking out into the distance of space and hoping for the best. Luke gets a robot arm, but Han Solo is frozen in carbonite, and you need another brand new sort of like plucky, swashbuckling, shit talking, bounty hunter adjacent-ish kind of guy.
You gotta have an asshole.
Yeah, you need an
asshole
smuggler guy,
asshole
right?
to hang around.
Yeah, he's handsome. He's, you know, maybe he's got a little asymmetrical shoulder pad stuff going on. And so they
that's
carved
Kyle
out.
Katarn. Dash Rendars are symmetrical. Kyle Katarn
that is true.
Is
that is
different
true. He's got the
like that. He's got a pauldron.
Katarn it. So they came up with this character named Dash Rendar. And Dash Rendar interacts with characters from the original trilogy in new ways against a new villain in a new conflict in the galaxy that nestles in tightly between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And this was like a big building that you could come into from multiple entry points, right? You could come into this from the comic side. And I know people who are really into comics who were like, did you hear about this new comic book? They're making a new comic book. For me, I was a big video game dork, and I was super into the N64, super into it. I think it's the first video game system I saved up for with my own money for months and months and months and months and months. Just like ask my dad how many times I could mow his lawn, rake leaves, go around the neighborhood, you know, shovel snow in New Jersey. And some guy would be like, here's $10. And I'd be like, I was out there for 5 hours, and games are $90 right now. And no one knows why. But I remember saving up for a really long time to get Shadows of the Empire, which is a video game adaptation of the story that happens in the comics. And to actually get into the narrative of what Shadows of the Empire were, those were the two biggest entry points, right? Because there were toys and you could make up your own adventures. And
so the comics, I think the weird thing is they cover different ground, which is really cool. I think the novel was like the big kind of like tentpole part of it. And that one follows Luke and Leia predominantly.
Interesting.
The game follows Dash Rendar. And
yeah.
The comics, I think they cover a bunch of stuff that happens in the book, but it also fixates more on Boba Fett. Weirdly enough, the comics was a part that I somehow didn't get into, even though I was like obsessed with Boba Fett at the time. But it was pretty much like, here's what all these characters are doing in this time that's, you know, totally gray area in terms of the original trilogy. And it's kind of cool. Like, again, you're missing that Han Solo element, but that's where Dash Rendar comes in. And basically he is pretty much beat for beat like a find and replace of what Han Solo is. He is a mercenary who flies a ship called the Outrider, which honestly looks like you just got AI to redesign the Falcon. Like it's a asymmetrical freighter. Actually, I think it might be like a fighter ship. It's not real. It doesn't matter. And instead of Chewbacca, he has a droid co-pilot who I think is named Lebo.
Yeah.
And he basically gets hired. In the game, it starts out and you do some of the greatest hits. You do the Battle of Hoth, you fight some ATSTs, you fight a bunch of Wampas. But it has the whole escape from Hoth. That's sort of the whole opening act. And then you wind up getting. So the big thing that Shadows of the Empire introduced, and the sort of the titular Shadows is Black Sun, which is a criminal organization that is led by Prince Shizor, who is. There's a bunch of stuff in here that has this wonderful kind of like sheen of like 90s try hard to it. Like Dash Rendar's design is very like X-Force. Like he's got lots of pouches. He's got big ass shoulder pads. His gun is bigger than it needs to be. Whatever. And then there's Shizor, who kind of like, he looks more like a Star Trek alien. I feel like he's green.
Yeah.
He's got like elf ears, I think, and he's got like scales, and he's got a ponytail, and he's got a power, which is that he has pheromones that make him incredibly sexy to anybody. And he has a cyborg assistant named Guri, who, again, this is that kind of stuff where like I understand why people take umbrage with this in the Star Wars space. As an 11-year-old, I was all about it. I thought it was the coolest stuff ever. But Guri is like she's a replicant basically. And like this is, you know, you've got droids in Star Wars. You've got all these like talking sentient metal men who are like, oh my goodness gracious me. And then here's this robot, theoretically, who looks exactly like a human woman, and she's very sexy and is apparently like they get a little bit weird. They're like, I think there's like, yeah, she's completely anatomically correct. It's basically just a Blade Runner replicant.
Yeah.
Which is super weird and out of place in Star Wars. And there's like no one else like that. They don't touch on that
really
at all.
That.
And the justification is that Prince Shizor is so rich that he can have this like cutting edge prototype, you know, fembot woman that nobody else has. Yeah. And the whole thing is that Shizor is he's like golf buddies with Palpatine. Like he's almost on the same level as Vader, but in the private sector or the criminal sector or whatever. And he's, you know, he schmoozes a bunch and he's very rich and powerful. And he's just got this wonderful kind of Bond villain energy to him. And the whole thing is he finds out that Vader is after Luke.
Yes.
And he sends like his goons to go after him, something like that. And I think he also is involved with I think he winds up schmoozing with Leia. Like there's a whole weird thing where he's like, come and dine with me, and it's like a whole kind of Dr. No thing where he's like, put on this sexy robe and come down to my chambers. And, you know, this is also where, it like explains a bunch of stuff that didn't really need explaining. Like it explains how Luke built his lightsaber, his green one that he has in Jedi. And it explains where Leia got the booish disguise that she wears when she sneaks into Jabba's palace. And
which is one of my favorite costumes in all of Star Wars.
Yeah. There's, I mean, honestly, like we love that. We love the beginning of Jedi and the end of Empire, and like this kind of fills in those blanks so well, and it's really cool. There's a lot of really fun stuff being played with there, and it's corny, like it's super goofy, but it's fun as hell. And like Shadows of the Empire, not a great video game, but like it was a pretty awesome N64 launch-ish game.
Yeah, it's very important to distinguish that. I think you nailed it right there. The thing is about if Shadows of the Empire, the video game, was your entry point for this story, there's a significant chance that you didn't experience most of the story because it is a very difficult video game. Like it's very tough. It's cheap. It's, you know, the camera is not great. There's like notoriously there's a level in the game where you basically are driving through like a garbage dump on like this floating flatbread texture. It's a polygon.
Ord Mantell, which is again that's a throwback. Where there's a line in Empire where it's like, oh, what about that bounty hunter we ran into on Ord Mantell? And it's like you go on a trade.
You meet IG-88, yeah, and like later in the game you fight Boba Fett, and like if you can get that far, it's amazing. But like you know, you touched on the Battle of Hoth, the fact that they were able to create that for the N64 on levels we'd never seen. Like to put it bluntly, like Shadows of the Empire was the first 3D Star Wars game I owned on a cartridge. You know, I had CD-ROMs, I had sharewares and other stuff like that. But I think this was the first Star Wars game that I owned that was like fully 3D. Because before that I had Super Star Wars and Return of the Jedi for Super Nintendo, all those games and stuff like that. Had some Game Boy games here and there. Most of them were hop and bop side scrollers. Also brutally difficult, you know, action platformers that had... took a lot of creative liberties. The NES one specifically, like originally, like Darth Vader turns into a scorpion at the end. Like there's all this stuff in the Return of the Jedi one where Luke's walk just to Jabba's palace's door is just like, oh man, he went through a lot of shit to get here. Like he fought like 5,000 sandworms and all this other crap.
Everything explodes.
There's everything just blows
like you'll
up.
shoot a womp rat and it blows up into 5 explosions. It makes no sense.
Yeah. But so getting the
like,
fly around Hoth was just like, and use your tow cable in your snow speeder and take down AT-ATs, and then the next level is a third person action level where you are exploring like Echo Base basically, and there's secrets everywhere, and there's one room where you open it up and a bunch of fucking wampas come out. The thing that rips off that Luke Skywalker chops off his arm.
Yeah, and that was a deleted scene from Empire. That was a thing that they couldn't use in the actual movie, so they were like, let's throw it in the game. Let's have a whole room full of wampas coming in and just causing a problem.
And notoriously, there was a bunch of cheat codes for that game that were really fun. But one of them let you play as a Wampa, and you could walk around that base as a Wampa and just maul stormtroopers. And I remember like it made no sense because there's a lot of very narrow pathways in that level, where you have to find huge rebel insignia that's like spinning in gold, just like in Star Wars.
I love it.
The Wampa could not really navigate those, but it was just so funny to see that. So like the game is like it's all over the place quality wise, but like when it works, and in terms of being an introduction to a bunch of like really cool iconic Star Wars characters and moments and scenes seen through the perspective of a brand new character, it was truly magical.
That was the first 3D Star Wars game that not just on cartridge, I think in general, because Jedi Knight was the first really big one, and now that you mentioned it, Shadows of the Empire came before that. It might have been one of the piloting games that was like that, but you had like Rebel Assault 2, which were like FMV games, and I think there was probably Snowspeeder stuff in there, Hoth stuff in there, but they've done the Battle of Hoth in like every Star Wars game. It's been in so many of them, and the one in Shadows of the Empire I remember being like pretty decent, like it was all right. But yeah, the later stuff gets pretty gnarly, it gets pretty messy. But I don't know, I was so stoked to play that. And so weird thing. I went to elementary school with Frank Oz's kids. Like, and at that point, like Star Wars was not a thing he really gave a shit about. And I remember just like playing, and his kids, like, they were like, I don't give a fuck about Star Wars. Like, like Mark Hamill came to Christmas one year and was like, hey, it's me, Luke. And they were like, oh, whatever.
Like, who are you?
But we like, we stayed up all night, like eating Warheads and drinking fucking sour soda or whatever, and like playing this game. And I just remember being like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, oh my God, your dad's going to be so stoked that we played the Star Wars game. And he's like, man, he doesn't really give a shit about Star Wars, man. That was like 15 years ago or whatever. Yeah. And then again, this was 1996, like probably about 20 minutes later, Lucas gave him a call being like, hey, do you want to be Yoda again? And then Frank Oz, who sounds also, was like, oh, probably I'll be Yoda again. They both have that voice. But like, yeah, it was funny because this was testing the waters for people giving a shit about Star Wars. Because like the thing that really kind of brought non-movie Star Wars into the forefront was the Thrawn trilogy, the Timothy Zahn novels, which came out in I think it was like 1991, maybe 1990. It was early, and those were some of the first big ones where it was like, oh, it's the big, like, this is continuing what happens after after Return of the Jedi. And those ones, I remember, again, they feel daunting. They feel like kind of overwhelming. And the idea there's this whole trilogy. And also there was something about them that I didn't really give a shit about. I don't know. There's something it didn't appeal to me initially. I think because it was so focused on the principal cast, like the original characters, and I was like, I want some like new guys with shoulder pads. Like I want some crazy stuff. But those books are really fun, and those are some of the first ones for like the new canon that they've gone into. Like Thrawn shows up in Ahsoka, like they've got him in Clone Wars or Rebels, whatever. Like he's front and center now. And there's bunch of things that they've brought out of there, but they don't really, there's some stuff where they're like, maybe we're not going to do that. Maybe we're not going to have a clone of Luke Skywalker named Luke Skywalker with 2 U's. Maybe we don't need that. But yeah, like with Shadows of the Empire, it was kind of like a multi-pronged attack, being like, okay, so these books are selling pretty well. People are really stoked on Star Wars novels. The comics are doing okay. Kids like trading cards. The video games have been, cooking for a minute now. Like LucasArts was kind of kept the lights on for Star Wars in terms of like consumable media. Like books and comics I think they were doing comics of, stuff like that for everything, like kind of tie-ins there. I think there was I guess that was just a big market. Like you'd get paperback fan fiction from the grocery store or whatever. Like I remember seeing that for a lot more stuff back then.
Yeah, there was a million comics. I remember going to like local like comic shows and card collectors, stuff like that. And there was always a lot of just like ancient Star Wars comics kicking around that I was always like so fascinated in, because
well, it was like
it was overwhelming. It was like where do you get in, right? Like where do you start with this stuff?
But I mean, it was for like dormant franchises. That's what like. There were the Aliens comics and there were Star Wars, which were both published by Dark Horse, and there was a kind of feeling of just like griminess to them. Like they were and you go to your actual bookstore, not the comic book store, and you'd go in the sci-fi section, and there'd be like, you'd see like recognizable logos. There'd always be some like crazy shit, like cube shaped fantasy novels like Shannara, whatever, and like R.A. Salvatore Fantasy Realms, like just big, and like the D&D like Forgotten Realms books. There'd be stuff where it's just like, I don't understand what that is, I cannot comprehend it. But then you'd see like Star Wars, and you're like, oh, what's this one about? Oh, it's the courtship of Princess Leia. Wonder what's going on there. Do they go to a planet full of witches and rancors? Maybe they do. Are they going to bang out? Who knows?
Yeah, it was always interesting because like you could step in a Shadows of the Empire and sort of understand it. Like you figured out where it sat in the timeline. This was before there was like even like debates about this kind of stuff, right? Like it wasn't even, we didn't talk about, I don't even know if we said the word canon back
I don't
then.
think so.
I don't think we did, or like the timeline, or like you just knew like, oh, this is before Return of the Jedi, after Empire Strikes Back.
Like, it was a mess. I think the canon conversation started when Lucas started making more movies, and like know, the thing that totally screwed me up is like I was like, here's who Boba Fett is. Here's all of the things that are true about him that I learned from a Daniel Keyes Moran short story in the tail end of Tales of the Bounty Hunters or whatever. This is all made up. This is one dude with an eye patch wrote these stories about Boba Fett that I was like, oh, this is clearly who this guy is. This is his backstory. And then Lucas is like, anyway, he's a little boy and he's a clone, and all the stormtroopers are based on his dad. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, what?
I remember like showing I was showing my kid, but I was watching Return of the Jedi with my wife a couple years ago, and I paused in the Jabba's palace, and I'm like, do you see that the spider robot back there? That's a Bomar monk. And like I break down the whole story of it, and I was like, hold on, and I was like, oh, there's an action figure or whatever. Like it's one of those things where you're just like this is what we thrived on for so long as Star Wars fans, because we didn't have new movies. We didn't have new shows. We got toys, we got comics, and we got expanded universe lore, and all of that stuff was really fun to play with. And that's why it was really interesting for us, because the Shadows of the Empire, like just as that sort of like left, that's when all of the special edition stuff started ramping up. And with that was like, Star Wars Insider magazine. I remember like getting that religiously, being obsessed over every page of that. And again, it was during the dark ages of Star Wars, so they weren't really making a lot of new stuff. But once they started being like, we're making new movies, they showed, Mos Espa, and like had these, they're like, oh, there's a Womp Rat now. This this robot that lifts a bar up and down. You want a toy of him? And you're like, yeah, I do. And I remember seeing the movie and then being like, is that the Outrider? They put the Outrider in like half a second of this.
That's right, they do. And also there's that one shot where they're going into Mos Eisley, and there's like, again, there's all these like CG robots like lifting up pipes and smashing droids on the head and stuff. And there's that shot of the Ronto, which is like the big furry brontosaurus basically. Mm-hmm. And this speeder bike dude zips through there, and that's a swoop trooper who's like basically, they introduce swoops, which are like they're like the chopper equivalent of a speeder bike. Yeah, it's a motorcycle. And there's a whole thing where basically like, Shizor sends a bunch of like swoop jockeys to go after Luke Skywalker while he's out in the desert building a lightsaber at Ben Kenobi's house, and then Dash Rendar shows up and like, kicks their asses, or like he gets on a swoop too. And I'm just like, I remember just like reading this, it's like, it's fan fiction. Like it's totally, it's all made up. Yeah. But just reading it as a kid and like losing my mind and being so stoked about what was going on in this. No, and then you get to see it in a video game, and it was like, oh my God, shit. Yeah. You're getting it from different sides. Like this is, I guess that's what's so cool about it, is that it was the most coordinated expanded universe thing that ever happened in Star Wars. And now we take that for granted because there's so many, everything has to check out. Like everything has to line up, whether it's happening in, comics, books, movies, podcasts, shows, whatever. It all has to be, you can't have any like You can't have any like fuzzy narrative there, which is kind of weird to me because like the whole thing is rooted in mythology, and mythology is completely all over the place. But I love that era of like expanded universe where if you read the foreword to Dark Empire is a trip because that's the one where Luke turns to the dark side, which is like, again, you're like, what is happening here? Why would this happen? Dark Empire is gnarly. Dark Empire uses a bunch of like really like grim, weird, rejected concept art for. You just holding it up there?
I'm holding up a copy
there. I love it.
Yeah. I think you gave that to me, actually. I forgot where I got that one.
But there's a forward in there where basically, I think it was it John? I think John Wagner wrote that. I think so. I might be wrong. But he basically, I think maybe Kevin J. Anderson wrote the intro. One author wrote the forward for the other one. And he's saying pretty much how like, okay, so we didn't really coordinate on who's doing what and what's happening where and what's going on when. And so like Dark Empire is like,
luckily Star Wars never did that again.
It's so funny, but like it's like 10 years after Jedi, and it's like everything is real fucked up and bleak. They cloned the Emperor, somehow Palpatine returned, but also they kind of explain all, and he's got these new things that are like, they're like Death Star trucks. They're like world devastators that they just pull a Galactus and like suck planets apart. And then there's this forward where it's like, so yeah, I was writing the Young Jedi Academy Adventures, and in that one, Han and Leia have 3 kids.
Yep.
And in this one, they only have 1 kid or whatever. And it's like they didn't even check like how many children do these characters have. Like they didn't have, I don't know what, they didn't have email probably. Maybe they had early email or something. But like there wasn't a feeling of like everything lined up. It was this feeling of sort of mythology. And weirdly enough, the Tales of the Bounty Hunters, all those little short story collections, those are rooted really heavily in the old role-playing game tabletop source books, where people would be like, all right, here's the background story on Snaggletooth. Here's Dr. Evazan. Here's where Dr. Evazan got his medical degree. Like, here's the backstory you didn't know you needed.
He got it online, actually.
Yeah, here's the deal with the Bomar monks. Here's why Ponda Baba is so mad all the time. Like, they just have all these details, and they basically would kick them off to a bunch of science fiction writers. They would write these stories. And there's a sense of, like, curation there that those all kind of lined up. And again, they're coloring within the lines of the existing trilogy. It's all stuff that you've seen in some capacity. It's not completely fabricated or made up. But then you have the stuff that kind of comes after, like Heir to the Empire, Dark Empire, all that stuff, and it kind of is just getting off the beaten path. And you're like, okay, how do we make a new big bad? How do we make a new, if the Empire is defeated, what's going on? Who's doing what? Does anyone care? Yeah. And Shadows of the Empire feels like a happy medium between the two, in that it's kind of carving out new territory, introducing new characters. It walks like a really interesting tightrope between the familiar and the unknown. And in the same way that, like, it reminds me a lot of Rogue One, in that it's kind of an answer to a question that maybe you thought about, but you didn't really, like, the impetus of Rogue One was like, okay, so who stole the Death Star plans?
Yeah.
It's basically the first sentence of the opening crawl. It's like, rebel spies have stolen the plans for the new battle station. And they're like, what if that was a whole movie? And then you got Andor, which is like, okay, so what's this guy's story? Let's do an entire, 2-season arc leading up to this. And all of that adds more context to what you've seen there. But again, it's asking this one little tiny question. And in Shadows of the Empire, it's like, what were they doing between these 2 movies? Like, what happened there? And it's so cool that managed to be a game, a comic, a pop-up book, like all these things. It got dedicated model kits. Like, that's so ambitious. And again, it was everything but like, it says a lot about sort of Star Wars' place in pop culture, especially at the time, that it had enough pull to make all this stuff happen without a movie. Yeah.
And I think for me, like, one of the like you nailed it on the sort of like that straddling the sort of familiar and the unknown. And I think one of the departments that handled that really well was the toys. The toys specifically were a lot of like, oh, okay, it's Luke Skywalker, right? So what's he doing? Oh, he's in like red power armor. That's weird. And it's like really bulky and like, for context, at the time I was really into Star Wars toys. Like I was just like, there was a whole bunch of different Star Wars lines kicking around. It was cheap enough to get a bunch of a bunch of the Cantina weirdos, or, puppet monsters from Jabba's palace, or any of the iconic guys. Most of them looked like they were on steroids, right? Like famously the Lando Calrissian is just like upper bat, but just jacked, right? And all the guys from that, there was Power of the Force line. But what the Shadows of the Empire toys did that I hadn't really seen the regular Star Wars toys do before, but I had seen other lines do, was 2-packs. And that was really cool because you would get 2 action figures in one package and they were facing off against each other, and they usually had some like weird new thing to them. So it would be like a character, like Darth Vader, but then he's next to Prince Zizor, right? Or like Boba Fett's here, and he's got this like gigantic new backpack that shoots missiles. Or like Chewbacca's here, he's got a weird flat top and an eye patch. Like, what's this guy's story? So even if you didn't know what Shadows of the Empire were, you saw these toys on the shelf, and you were like, did they make a new Star Wars movie? Or like, what is this?
Pretty much.
Or like, and for me at the time, I was like, they made toys based on the video game. No one does that. No one made toys based on video games at the time of this. I grew up as a huge Nintendo fan, and I was always like, when are you guys going to make action figures? And they're like, well, we made figurines with applause, and you can put them on a birthday cake. And you're like, no, dude, like articulate action figures with action features and little jetpacks, and like, give Mario some spring boots or whatever. Like, oh, we have McDonald's Happy Meal toys. And it's like, no, I just want give me action figures. And so seeing Shadows of the Empire on a card back in a Toys R Us on an action figure with Boba Fett and some armor I'd never seen him in before, like this huge thing.
So you're mixing up that was the deluxe one, which was just a stupid toy. That was just a toy line where they were like, let's just make missile launching more expensive versions of basic toys.
So what did Boba Fett was in a 2-pack with who?
Boba Fett was in a 2-pack with IG-88, and I don't think they'd put out IG-8 as a single carded figure at that point. I don't think he came out until a little bit later, but like that's, I scooped that up, and that came with a comic.
Yep.
Then there was the Vader and Shizar one, and it was smart because it was like, here's a fairly well-known character packaged with another one who maybe you're not super familiar with.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is like I think it was the pop-up book was just about Boba Fett and IG-88 fighting, because like as the old canon would have it, basically what happens is all these assholes show up on the bridge of the Executor, and they're like, Darth Vader comes out and he's like, all right, I need you to go catch this guy who's trying to fuck this lady who I don't know is my daughter or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like, go get this man, catch him, catch this ship. And, you got Dengar and Forlom and Zuckuss and Boba Fett and Bosk and IG-88, and they're all hanging out there. And then Boba Fett is the one who, like, scoops them. And you don't hear about... I think Dengar shows up in the background of Jedi. I'm not even sure. I know he's supposed to be there canonically. I don't know if he actually shows up or not. And they... I love it because they're like... So what happens? Boba Fett got them, and then it's just this game of tag where like everyone is going after Boba Fett to try to get to steal his shit, just to get his, to steal his Han Solo and Carbonite. And again, this is one of the things that probably made me really get excited about Boba Fett is like, as a character, he gets introduced in Empire and he stands around mostly. He doesn't really do anything, and he like misses a few shots at Luke, and then he like escapes in this dope looking ship, and you don't really see him again. You're like, all right, what's this guy's story? And his entire background is rooted very tightly with toys. Like he's very much connected with that. That's a whole thing. And then in Jedi, he shows up, doesn't do anything, and then falls in a pit. Like he just shows up and he completely just like he just beefs it. And like Shadows of the Empire was where they were basically like, okay, no, but he kicks ass. And it's like, okay, this guy's going to give you the runaround. You fight him in a video game. He's a super tough boss.
Yeah.
Or here's a pop-up book where he blows up IG-88. But don't worry, there's 5 more IG-88s, and they all share one brain. And one of them becomes the second Death Star. Again, expanded universe was fucking wild. They got crazy over there. But like,
I mean, is it much different than like IG-11 burned in a fire, and now he's they brought him back and he's powered by a Grogu, a baby Yoda. Like it's the same nonsense that we love with a different coat of paint, which I appreciate. What was great about all that was just sort of being like, I can recreate the stories of this with action figures at home, where I can collect them, I can pose them. And one of the reasons like you and I decided to talk about this today specifically was because they just announced, which is odd because this is like, Shadows of the Empire is not canon, but it's also not forgotten by official modern Lucasfilm and Star Wars in general. Star Wars: The Black Series, which is like an action figure line, has been going on forever. 6-inch scale toys, and they do some 4-inch ones too, which I believe they package under like the vintage collection now. Announced that they're doing a whole bunch of new Shadows of the Empire action figures, and they showed off a brand new sculpt of the Leia Bush toy and the Luke Skywalker with the red power armor and the Prince Jizor, and people looked through the cliff notes or the fine notes on the bottom, and they mentioned something about Dash Rendar, and you and I got all excited. And
that's what inspired this episode, as we were just texting about action figures.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, I always have an action figure within reach. I generally have a Star Wars Black Series figure. I just bought Captain Brutus from Skeleton Crew, the big wolf with like 6 guns. I love him. He's great. And so like seeing this was just like, oh man. And they're doing it like, they brought the logo back and the purple packaging and all that stuff like that. And it's so much fun to see them say, okay, we've moved. There was like that rapture, right? Where they said, we're saying goodbye to all extended universe stuff. It's all Legends now. And people got really hurt about it because like a lot of really cool stories disappeared with that, but they needed to find some way to say like, well, like, Han Solo has one kid and here's his name. He's the villain in the new movie. Are you guys cool with that? And it's like, not really, but we'll deal with it. And, a lot of people were upset about that, but I do like that, like little by little with, with different characters and with different toys and stuff like that, they've gone back in and sort of been like, hey, you know what? We're not going to acknowledge this canon wise, but we will acknowledge that it was a fucking cool toy.
Yeah.
So he's back.
Well, I mean, it's fun to get toys. It doesn't matter if they're canon or not. They're action figures. You're going to play with them. There's always been that level to it. But they have been, I think Jizor shows up in Rebels. Like he's a key player, and like the Black Sun is like a big criminal organization that has their whole they have a whole thing going on. They're out there, which is pretty cool. They haven't done anything with Dash Rendar as far as I know, but I have an idea for how they could put him in the new canon and have it work. You just make him a compulsive liar. You have Dash Rendar sitting at a bar, and he makes up this entire story where he's like, oh yeah, the Rebel Alliance, the Princess Leia, she was totally into me. She hired me to help her track down Han Solo when he was in that brick of carbonite. And everyone's like, dude, Dash, you're full of shit. What are you talking about?
Like a grown-up Fern from Skeleton Crew who's just like, hey, there's 100 people died in the development project down beneath this mine or whatever. I love that. You and I, so Star Wars Outlaws came out recently, and I adored it. And what was interesting about it was it is the first thing since Shadows of the Empire that they've done that like specifically takes place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi that like they consider part of the canon, right?
Well, the comics have been messing around in there,
a
fair amount.
Yeah. And so like, this is the first video game at the very least, and you and I interviewed the creative director Julian Garrity, I think 6 times since the day the game was announced, and literally 3 days after the game came out, or I think the week the game came out, we were in Gamescom in Germany, and
he was sick of us.
Yeah, he was so sick of us. But we were like little kids because every time we'd be like, so Julian, this is the first video game that takes place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Is Dash Rendar going to be there? Are they going to have the Outrider? We just go through all that?
Chris Farley show with that. Like
and to my knowledge, I don't think they put any Easter eggs for Shadows of the Empire into that game, or at least I didn't see an Outrider. I didn't see Dash Rendar.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something in there kicking around. Weirdly enough, like one of the first things is an Easter egg, is a callback to Indiana Jones: The Fate of Atlantis. Like you're always picking out like orichalc. Like there's some crafting material. Like orichalcum is the mystical Atlantean metal that you collect beads of in Fate of Atlantis and use them to like activate a magic amulet or whatever, which is so funny to see that pop up in there. Jedi Survivor had an entire costume that was basically Dash Rendar's outfit.
That's right.
And
that was
lost
awesome.
my mind when that popped up. I got so excited about that because again, the shoulder pads, man, they're back in. They're in fashion again. All that 90s stuff, it's hot. It's hot now. People are into it.
Ladies used to wear them in the 80s, which was, I remember my mom would just like, she would put on like a pantsuit thing to go to work.
Yeah, but did she wear any bandoliers? Did she have any giant guns like cable?
I think she put them on when she got there.
Yeah. No, I don't know. It's Shadows of the Empire it's an oddity. It's a strange one, but it's also such a integral part of our love of Star Wars. And it's the thing that's about Star Wars is that it's always going to be changing and evolving, and new stuff's going to be added, and it can be very easy to get sort of beleaguered and tired out about it and just be like, oh, I don't have any faith in this. But it's it's always, I mean, if it's something that you like, and I imagine if you've listened to two dudes talk about it for 38 minutes, you probably like it a little bit too.
A passing interest.
You can always just go back to the stuff that made you like it and just kind of like, you know, ruminate on that and think back about how it felt to be a little kid and to be like, you know, and the best, you know, the best newer Star Wars stuff taps into that, and you get that moment where you're like, oh, I feel like a kid again. But even so, it's like, I don't know, looking at old action figures, I'm like, oh my God, I totally forgot about that guy. Or, oh, I remember this one. And like, there's just, Shadows of the Empire was all the above. And like, I don't know, I want to track down that pop-up book about IG-88 and show that to my kid. Because, you know, I think that one was by, I think that was the brothers Hildebrandt who did a bunch of those X-Men Marvel Masterpiece cards, weirdly enough.
Oh, weird.
Doing pop-up books and stuff. Maybe they did the trading cards for Shadows of the Empire, actually. I could be mixing. I think that was it. But anyway, yeah, Shadows of the Empire rules. Shout outs to the Empire. You know, again, it's like it's not canon. It doesn't exist anymore. But none of this stuff ever did. It's all, you know, it's all fake. All
it's
of it.
Fantasy.
You know? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm sitting around waiting until they make more Star Wars that I get excited about, and some of it comes and goes, and I don't always get excited about it. But it's like, I don't know. Maybe one of these days we're gonna get more Dengar. Maybe they can put Dengar in there. He's gonna do something because you know, that was it. When I was a kid, I was all just like, yeah, Boba Fett. He's the coolest. He's the cool one. But now I'm old and I like Dengar. Yeah, I identify with him because he's a sleepy old toilet mummy, a little bit hungover.
Yeah, he is just not. He's not. You know, he doesn't feel like getting all dressed up or doing anything. I know he has his own shit, but like, you know, it's probably just like a big, like a tomb or like just like an old car that has like, you know, the ones that have like different colored doors on them because there was an accident and like,
I mean, that's all the ships in Star Wars. They all look like old cars that were in accidents.
True.
That's the best part.
That is true. No, and I will say too, like the video game, I won't say like it totally holds up, but it is worth revisiting. It's very easy to emulate with cheats if you want to get through all the tough stuff in it and just experience it. Or there's, you know, a million people have played through it in its entirety if you just want to watch like a let's play of it or something like that. Those are out there too.
You know what I love about that game? I don't love it, actually. It was one of those things that sort of bothered me at the time. When you fight IG-88, they decided that his knees don't work, so he just like goose steps everywhere.
Oh yeah,
and he just goes donk 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 donk. And for the longest time, I don't know if that was considered canon or if that was the approach. And it was a cool minute before they made an action figure where you could actually bend his knees. And when they finally did, it was very nice. But also those rickety little chicken legs are kind of hard to pose with. So I don't know. Maybe not the best. What's your favorite part of Shadows of the Empire?
I honestly think it's the first time I got to play as a Wampa and maul a bunch of stormtroopers. But it's also, I think it's just the Dash Rendar action figure I had. Like that was just like a really cool special toy to me. It felt like my Han Solo. You know, obviously we had Han Solo growing up, but it was just like, but they made this one for us. Like we're the new class and we're here. We're not like, you know, like the old crusty 60s, 70s guys that grew up with this stuff. Like this is our first new Star Wars character that's just for us.
He's kind of the Poochie of Star Wars. Like he's got the Star Wars equivalent of like a backwards hat and a skateboard. It's just like yeah.
Extremely like Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane era pouchies.
Yeah. I like that. I like Dash Rendar too. I always like the swoops a lot. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I have a particular fondness for like the little vest that Luke Skywalker wears because he's wearing his like Jedi robes, but they just give him like this adventure vest, like he's a crocodile hunter or whatever, and it doesn't make any sense, but it totally works. Like it blends the, you know, it's like the Malibu Stacy new hat effect. You're like, oh, he's got a vest. I think they just maybe it wasn't that. I think they're doing a different Luke Skywalker figure. Anyway, it's one
more shout out to the fact that playing that game, I think I heard the probe droid noise like 600 times. You hear that? It's this one or two recordings they just loop through the first two levels just constantly, and you never unhear them. And they put that in like every Star Wars game now, and I love it. It's sort of like the Star Wars video game Wilhelm scream. But it's just
yeah. They also have video Wilhelm screams in there. I don't think they use them in the video game as much, but
they should do that.
They should do. Anyway, system. Shout out to the Empire.
Oh, wait, hold up. One more thing. Before we go, just a very friendly reminder / desperate plea for all of our listeners to support the show however you can.
Each and every single like, share, subscribe, rating, review, follow, favorite, bookmark, upvote, and comment we receive helps us grow our audience.
Even a good up dog helps us out.
Every single little tidbit of organic interaction we get helps convince those cold, unfeeling algorithms that this show is actually worth anyone's time.
Good old-fashioned word of mouth works too, so if you think this show rules, tell people about it. Tell your friends,
lovers, strangers, enemies, whoever.
And of course, we might have mentioned kicking us $1 or $2 on Patreon is huge. Also has some really cool perks.
For instance, $1 a month gets access to bonus content. $5 gets you each week's episode on Tuesdays instead of Fridays.
And for a few dollars more, you can help decide the good, bad, and ugly topics for future episodes.
Head to patreon.com/thisthingrules to see for yourself. However you support the show, even if it's just making time to listen to us talk about our favorite stuff, you rule, and we love you for it. We'll see you next week. Or we'll hear you next week. Or you hear us.
You'll hear us.
We'll talk to you later.
Next week.
We'd like to give a big supersized special thanks to our Patreon backers Ben Burkhalter, Kevin Lemasurier, Steve Cam, Brennan Bova, Donald Cole, Billy McKendry, Caleb Hilliard, Chip Chunkling, Go-Go, Jason Waterfalls, and Scott Davis. You all rule for supporting the show. Thank you so much.